Hello, everyone. This is the 32nd episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England. For this episode, we start a new interview series with Mr. David AJ Reynolds as we discuss Hungarian football in the 1920s and 30s. We aim to have a series of interviews with Mr. Reynolds as we examine the Hungarian football first in the 1920s and 30s, followed by the 1950s glory years, and culminating with the 1960s and the 1966 World Cup. Mr. Reynolds is an English writer, editor, and teacher. He has lived and worked in the United States, Hungary, and currently resides in the Czech Republic. He is the author of Revising History in Communist Europe, Constructing Counter-Revolution in 1956 and 1968. He has also contributed articles to the Hungarian Review and the Technoskeptic. Hello, David. Welcome.
Hello, Sean. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Hello, David. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Paul. Thank you. My pleasure.
Just as an introduction, could you please tell us a little bit about your early football memories and your background in the game?
My earliest football memories is going to Spurs with my dad. So my dad and my grandfather are big Tottenham fans, and so that's my earliest memory, is going to White Hart Lane with my dad and my brother when I was a boy. So I grew up with the pleasure and the pain of being a Spurs fan, and still am to this day, of course. So that's my first love is Spurs. And the other big interest growing up football-wise for me was Dutch football, because my mother is Dutch. And so my family in Holland, many of them are big football fans, as you would expect. And so that was another great fascination for me, was Dutch football, as it is with many people, isn't it, as well? And Ajax, of course, particularly. So that was growing up. Those were my two big loves, were Spurs and Dutch football.
With that, we can start with football in Hungary.
Yes.
Can you tell us who were the early pioneers of football in Hungary in the early 20th century into the 1920s?
Well, I mean, football got going in Hungary in a similar way to the way it did in a number of countries, in that it was imported via English businessmen, English educational institutions, teachers, people like that were the first people, either English people or Hungarians who had come into contact with English football through being in England at university or contacting with businessmen. Now, I think we'll talk about Vienna and Austria a bit later, but some of the first people who became interested in football in Hungary contacted with it in Vienna through football that was beginning there, through the big expat community that was in Vienna. But it's relatively late in the 19th century that it gets going, but it develops very quickly. So the first football match, the first formal football match in Hungary is in 1897. And only 4 years later, they have a football association and a league starting. So it develops very, very quickly. And the first people who are really the pioneers of Hungarian football are, again, is the case almost everywhere at this time, is they're not football players, they're athletes, they're sports people, and they take part in every sport that they can get their hands on. So these early pioneers are football players, in addition to being athletes in general, members of athletic clubs, members of sports associations, and football at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is just another arrow in their quiver of sports that they play. So, for example, the first manager of the Hungarian football team, Ferenc Guillemot, he's a cycling champion first. He's a member of a sports association. He gets interested in football, comes into contact with it, plays in the first ever match, Hungarian football match in 1897, and therefore is one of the early experts, as it were, in the game in Hungary. Another one of the early pioneers is a man called Alfred Hayash, and he won 2 gold medals in the first modern Olympics in swimming, and was an incredible athlete in all sorts of disciplines by all accounts. But he was one of the first players to represent Hungary again. He's also one of the first Hungarian managers of the national team. And so this is the pattern that we see. It's people who are athletes in general, sports people. They're involved in this, something that is, again, familiar for, I think, English football lovers, is this, the club, the association, this very sort of middle-class Victorian institution where people congregate, where people develop friendships, where people develop associations with each other. This is the milieu, to use a pretentious word, that this is coming out of. There's another gentleman called Ferenc Stober, and he is again involved in the first match. He's early on involved in the national team and in the football association. He deserves some credit and some attention. He was one of the people to translate the rules into Hungarian, for example, which sounds a very prosaic thing, of course, but that would be a very important thing to do: get hold of the rules and put them into a form in the local language that made sense. And that process, to give you an illustration of how quickly things developed in Hungary in terms of football, is that there's a nice story just from a few years earlier, from 1893, where a school teacher was introducing football in his school, in his sort of grammar school, or the equivalent of a grammar school. And he got hold of the rules and translated them, but unfortunately translated them in a slightly confused fashion. And so this football match that he organized, the outfield players could only use their hands and the goalkeeper could only kick the ball. So when you have 8 years after that, you have an association, the league beginning, you can see that how quickly the game is developing from these amateurs and enthusiasts and all-round sportsmen who are really getting the game going.
You mentioned about this first match. Can you talk more about that?
It's an interesting event because, again, it's one of these sports clubs that there were in Budapest at the time. It's called BTC, which stands for Budapest Gymnastics Association, or Gymnastics Club, really. So organized sports in Hungary develop in a way that you would recognize from Central Europe in general at this time, is that it comes out of what we call gymnastics in English. It's Turn in German. They have the Sokol movement in Bohemia. In Hungary, it's called Turna, from the German word. And that's really the first organized sports in the country in the way that we would think of it now. And so the first sports clubs are gymnastics associations, really. And this is one of them. And they do lots and lots of different sports. They branch out into outdoor sports, which is a rebellious thing to do because not everybody approved of that sort of thing. But they branch out into outdoor sports, and then they get hold of footballs. We're not exactly sure who. There's different stories of how they did. And they start practicing a few years before that. And so they're actually the first official match, official in the terms that it was advertised. Spectators were asked to come, and a few did. It's actually a match between 2 teams within this club. So it's BTC, who were the first. They were the champions of the first Hungarian league, but they basically have I think the Americans would call it a scrimmage, wouldn't they, between 2 teams within this club. That's actually their first official game. And so the person I mentioned, Ferenc Guillemot, he's one of the participants in this game, for example. And it went on from there. But that's the first one really was an inter-club match. And it was 5-0, by the way. That's the final result, just for those keeping score.
A name that we've actually discussed in previous podcasts is Jimmy Hogan. And it seems that he's been acclaimed as the innovator of Hungarian football in the era that we're going to discuss. Do you think that's accurate or perhaps an exaggerated view?
It's difficult, this really, because I think it's definitely exaggerated, but I wouldn't want that to give the impression to denigrate him, because he was very, very influential, and it's not his fault that it's been exaggerated in that sense. I think it is exaggerated in a couple of ways. I think the first way is just that he's given sort of a very general credit for everything that happens between his arrival and the 1953 and 1954 team. I think his influence, if we want to make it more specific, I think his influence really is in terms of technique. It's not really in terms of formations and systems or style of play in the broad sense, but more in just bringing what we would think of as a professional focus on football technique, ball handling skills, just that sort of thing. He's not the first person to have that focus, but he's by far the most rigorous one. And so I think he deserves a lot of credit for bringing that kind of attention to detail, focus on technique, focus on training players rigorously on how to control the ball and deal with the ball in every possible way imaginable, which would have been new really almost anywhere at this time, and not just in Hungary. So he deserves credit for that, and certainly had a big impact on influencing people who worked with him to manage in that sort of style of being, that we recognize, I guess, today, don't we, of being very, almost an obsessive attention to detail, looking at every aspect of how a player uses and handles the ball. Where he doesn't deserve credit so much is really, he doesn't have a big influence in terms of the broader, there's no tactical innovation, I wouldn't say, in the way we would talk about it now. He's not changing the formation. His team still play with the traditional 2-3-5 that everybody really plays with at this time. And there are other managers both before and around him who are also developing the quality of the play in Hungary. So, for example, I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about him later, but there was a Hungarian player called Imre Pozsonyi, and he was the person really who introduced a passing style to the team that Jimmy Hogan took over, MTK. So MTK, right from the beginning, basically, right from the first year where they were competitive in the Hungarian league, they developed a style that was more short passing, as opposed to what people think of as the English style, sort of push and run, speed-based, strength-based. So he's really the person who makes MTK a team that plays a bit differently from that and starts playing in sort of the Scottish style of pass and possession-based. So that's 15 years before Hogan arrives that he's doing that, 1903, 1904. And then you've got a Scottish manager, John Robertson, at the beginning of that decade, at the beginning of the 1910s, who spends 2 years there as manager. And again, his emphasis is on a passing style football rather than a push and run style. So Hogan arrives at a club during the war that is already a bit different. It's already a club that really emphasizes possession and passing football. So he's then able to add to that just a level of expertise and a level of focus that pushes that onto the next level. So I wouldn't describe him so much as an innovator, just as he perfected something, and he took something that was already there and just made it brilliant and just made it that much better than anybody else was able to do at that time. And just in general, I think before that decade, the 1910s is the decade, again, mostly before Hogan arrives, where Hungarian football sort of pushes on to a sort of a second level in terms of the top clubs, in terms of the national team, in terms of the attention that is given to football. So he arrives at a time where the game is developing in a way that he can have a big impact. So I hope that doesn't give the impression to do him down at all. He was clearly a brilliant man. And if so many Hungarian players who played with him give him credit, then that means something, doesn't it? But I would say to draw the distinction between his impact on the way, the quality of play, I think is his impact. It's not so much on formation or tactics in the big picture, I think.
Is his name still mentioned regularly in Hungarian football circles, or do you think maybe his reputation's sort of faded a little bit over the years?
I don't think so. No, he's still somebody that everybody is familiar with. He's still somebody who's recognized, or everybody, I mean, football people, he's still somebody who's recognized as a pioneer and one of the sort of the people at the beginning, the heroes of the emergence of Hungarian football. So no, I think he's definitely given the respect that he deserves to this day, which is wonderful, because I'm sure talked about and discussed before how the sad thing for Jimmy Hogan is that he was respected everywhere except England, really, which is a shame, to say the least.
Besides Hogan, how was the game spread in Hungary, and who were the first British or other foreign coaches?
So the game in Hungary, if we're talking about the first 2 decades particularly, but even beyond that of the 20th century, it's mostly a Budapest game. There are clubs from outside of Budapest who develop and grow and become good teams, but the vast majority of the players and the teams are in the capital. And so that's where to begin with, the connection with Vienna is meaningful. Vienna was then, is now about a 3-hour train ride from Budapest. So it's very easy to go back and forth. People would go and watch games there. Particularly, they'd go and watch English teams. So English teams visited frequently and would often go to Vienna particularly. The gentleman I mentioned earlier, Ferenc Stober, who was one of these early pioneers, when Tottenham were playing Everton in Vienna in 1905, he took a group of 350 people to Vienna to watch that game. I like that because it involves Tottenham, but also it gives you an indication of the enthusiasm that there is to watch the best at that time and learn from it. So there's that keenness to watch English teams, to watch visiting teams, to develop the skills and the expertise even there early on. So it spreads particularly in the capital. It spreads particularly between schools, athletic clubs, athletic associations. Those are the people who are learning about it and teaching it at the beginning.
So those friendlies, obviously a lot of British clubs visited Central Europe at that time, as you say, Vienna, Budapest, Prague. Do you think that influenced the style of play at all in those countries?
I think it did to some extent. I think the biggest impact, early on is just because they played so many games as well against the foreign teams as well. I mean, by the 1910s, the big clubs would play a dozen exhibition matches against international clubs a year, a season. They would play almost half as many as league games again in exhibition matches. So I think there's some influence on style, but I think the bigger influence was it was a really big push for the improvement of the game, because they were so often, pitting their wits against the best teams and the best clubs. I think it's one of the things that pushes the game on so quickly in the 1910s is because they're so consistently playing visiting English teams and teams from other countries. So I think it provides a real incentive and catalyst. I think it's one of the things that pushes the game on. And style, just to the degree of seeing some of the things that were seeing a more developed example of the kinds of things that they were already doing. So in the case of the passing style game, just seeing that being performed at a slightly higher level. But I wouldn't say it caused any revolutionary changes in that sense. I think it was more of the competitive push. And that alongside, I think the three things, as I said before, I think the early 1910s is when the game in Hungary really takes a huge leap forward in many ways. And I think it's those three things pushing it. There's that incredible amount of games that they're playing with foreign teams, German teams, Austrian teams, English teams. But then there's also the two big rivalries of Hungarian football that are there almost from the beginning of the game as a serious game, which is the Austria-Hungary rivalry in international football. There's been no international game played more than that game, Austria-Hungary. And then the domestic rivalry between MTK and Ferencváros almost immediately is a central part of the game. And that really helps in terms of driving the interest in the capital in football. And of course, as soon as it starts driving the interest, it starts increasing the seriousness of the football. Because one of the things in that first 20 years is the slow transition from that situation I mentioned of everybody's a multi-sport player, slowly that changing to footballers are mainly playing football and they're mainly concentrating on football. And then, of course, you get a big increase in quality when somebody's playing football 10 months of the year and they're not doing football, swimming, cycling, wrestling, athletics, which is what a lot of people were doing to begin with. Those three forms of competition really drive interest and drive specialization of the people who are playing the game, I think.
So the relationship with Austria, what would you say was the influence of Austria and Austrians on the development of Hungarian football?
Well, I would say to begin with, not much in terms of Austrians themselves. So the early teams, the early Austrian clubs and teams that were facing Hungarian teams were almost all English people and British people in those teams, much more than was the case in Hungary, just because there was a lot more expat businessmen from Britain living in Vienna than there was living in Budapest. I would say in terms of Austrians themselves in the first decade, not very much at all. And Hungary really soon overtakes Austria in terms of the teams and the play. I think that where Austria becomes really influential in return, I think is later on with the way that those great Austrian teams develop, particularly in the late 20s and 30s. Having said that, I draw the distinction between Austrians having an influence on the development of Hungarian football, but that sort of Vienna-Budapest axis is extremely influential because that in some ways, those two places are the main football brains of the region, if you like. That's where the most people are congregating, talking about football, discussing football, watching football. So people are going back and forth between those two places all the time, both to play in matches, to watch matches, to talk, all of those things. So I would say Vienna and Budapest particularly have sort of a symbiotic relationship in those early years, in that a lot of the knowledge is going back and forth between there, and they grow together in that way. And the first, I can't remember the number now, but I would say probably the first 6 or 7 matches that a Hungarian national team play, it's really Vienna v Budapest is what the game is. Even when we get to the first matches that are recognized as internationals, it's really a Budapest team against a Vienna team that are competing against each other. So I think that's really important for the early development of the game, that exchange and that connection.
In our Argentina and Uruguay podcasts, we learned that the game was spread via the British railway workers in those nations. Can we say that maybe the game was spread in Hungary via what was happening in Austria and observing what was happening there, and it got transplanted in Hungary as a result?
To some extent, I think you can say that, certainly in the very, very early days. But I think what you have in Hungary is more, in the first 20 years of the 20th century anyway, is more Hungarians picking up the game through contacts in Vienna or through contacts in England and then running with it. It's not so much an ongoing connection. Now, there are English people involved in Hungary, but much less than in Austria. For example, you had a man called Edward Shires, who also played in Austria, in Vienna, and he moved to Budapest. He played in Hungary in that first decade of the 20th century. In the 1910s, you have a couple of players. There's a Joe Lane and there's a player called Owen, but it's very few and far between. And there's not really British managers until John Robertson in 1911. Ferencváros have a man called Gannon, who sometimes is described as a manager, but he was really a fitness coach, and he worked for the sports club across disciplines and not just in football. And some people make the connection between that and the idea that MTK are playing this Scottish style passing game and Ferencváros are playing the more English style push and run. And I think to some extent early on there's some truth to that as far as one can tell. But there's not a lot of direct English influence at this time. It's more of a case of, as you say, picking up on things, watching games, playing the English teams in exhibition matches, but there's not a lot of those early English apostles of the game that you find all over the world. There's not so many of those in Budapest as there are in other places where the game develops. Another thing that actually happens in Hungary that doesn't happen elsewhere is they really try and put a stop to that, to the influence. So I mentioned the English player Owen, and he was playing in Hungary around 1913, and they actually introduced a rule. The Hungarian Association introduced a rule which they named after him. It was the Lex Owen. That meant a foreign player couldn't play in the Hungarian league unless he had been living in Hungary for a year beforehand. So as you would expect, that basically means very, very few foreign players are going to play in the league unless they're in Hungary for another reason. They're certainly not going to travel to Hungary to play in that context. Of course, we're still in amateur days in Hungary as well. There's influence and people are picking things up, but direct influence is quite small.
What tactics or tactical changes were coming in Hungary in these early days of 1910s, 20s, and 30s?
Well, in terms of the zeros and the tens, I would say tactically, we're not seeing any big changes. I suppose people interpret tactics a bit differently sometimes, don't they? But certainly the formation is the same. There's no big developments in that. You have, right from the beginning, as I mentioned earlier, you have the introduction of a short passing game in particularly MTK. I think one thing you might give Hogan additionally credit for is I think he broadens the idea of a passing game a little bit away from a very rigid short passing game. So I think particularly early on when clubs in Hungary and elsewhere decided they wanted to play a passing game, what that really meant was lots of very short passing and almost in a very conservative way of playing where you kept the ball as far away from the opponents as you could, really, almost like hiding the ball. And I think Hogan wasn't an ideologue in that sense of we just have to have passing at all costs. And you would see under his style, short passing, long passing, cross the field passing, diagonal passing. It wasn't so much of the early tiki-taka people to death that we saw more recently. So I think you can see some development in there just in terms of the passing game. For the people who are playing the passing game in Hungarian football, it's becoming more sophisticated in the sense that there's a quick passing game. And I think you see that in Hungary in the 20s and the 30s, that when you see a Hungarian side playing a passing possession game, it's not a slow passing possession game, it's quick. They will come at you fast. And I think that's not so much a matter of tactics, it's just more a matter of disposition maybe. Because you can plant the same idea in different places, can't you? It's going to be implemented differently. And I think the character of Hungarian football, to the degree that it's developing in these early years, it's developing a technical sophistication in terms of people are more and more learning in detail how to handle the ball and deal with the ball. But when it's put into a game situation, it's fast, it's quick. If you play one of these good Hungarian teams, they're not going to sit back and keep the ball. It's not that kind of passing game. They're going to attack you. And you can see that's something that I think you can see right through this period and then developing on into the 50s. When we think of possession or passing football, we might think of almost a strangling the game to death sort of approach. That definitely wasn't how it was being put into practice in Hungary, particularly, I would say, when you get to the 20s and 30s.
Who were the key Hungarian players during this era, and how did that generation influence the development of Hungarian football as managers later on?
Those early years, you have a few people who end up in management. So if we think of MTK, for example, people usually think of Imre Schlosser and Alfred Schäfer. Imre Schlosser started at Ferencváros and then moved to MTK in the mid-1910s, but then spent a long time there. Alfred Schäfer was always an MTK man, and he comes back to the club after being abroad for a long time and wins a couple of championships with MTK. One thing that I should say as context to this is that what we haven't mentioned yet is, starting with the post-World War I period, you have an extraordinary exodus of Hungarian managers and players based on the political and the economic situation. There's a historian called Péter Szegedi who's written extensively on Hungarian football, and it's his estimate that half of the Hungarian footballers and managers left the country after 1920, which is an extraordinary figure. So you do get a lot of, for that reason, not because they're going abroad out of choice to spread their legs, but just out of that reality, you have a lot of Hungarian managers and players abroad in the 20s and 30s. And some of them make their way back and some of them don't. So there's lots of examples of people like this. One of the ones that I like to mention is József Nagy, because he starts off, he moves abroad, he goes to Italy like a lot of Hungarian managers and players did. He wins the Mtropa Cup with Bologna, and then he ends up in Sweden, and he manages the Sweden national team that plays Hungary in the World Cup semi-final in 1938. And he has a long career managing abroad. A lot of these players and managers go abroad and they never come back. If people who are interested in those sorts of people should particularly read Jonathan Wilson's book, The Names Heard Long Ago, which is well worth purchasing and reading. He's particularly interested in those people who sort of disseminate a certain way of playing. I tend to be more interested in the people who didn't leave, who stuck around. And so you get, I would say, there's a person called István Tóth, who's a very good player, plays for the national team, plays for Ferencváros. He then becomes a manager, manages Ferencváros very effectively. There's another Ferencváros international called Zoltán Blum, plays many games for the national team and for Ferencváros. And he then manages Ferencváros for about 7 years in the 1930s. Very unusual. I know it's unusual now, but it was even more unusual then for somebody to be the manager for that long. And I think he's particularly important because the team that he manages becomes really the heart of that 1938 World Cup team. So a lot of the players that he develops there become really, really important key players. We'll probably talk about them later. Another person that I think doesn't get much credit, slips through the cracks a bit, is another Ferencváros man called Mihály Pataki. And he was another top player in the early years. And he moves into management, but mainly actually coaching. And he's a big influence in that same regime under Zoltán Blum at Ferencváros. And to talk about tactical innovation, as you were mentioning earlier, he's probably one of the people, it's hard to say for sure, but it seems that he was one of the people who first introduces the WM in Hungary. And so Ferencváros, right at the end of the 30s, start playing in the WM formation, which obviously had particularly been developed by Herbert Chapman and dare we say at Arsenal. So there's people like that who are having a big impact at home. So I think the people who are most famous are the people who go abroad and stay abroad, particularly in Italy. Of course, Bela Gutmann obviously is very, very famous. Bela Gutmann is interesting is that he does keep coming back to Hungary and managing in Hungary. So he's one of the people who comes out of the MTK school, and really learns that style of play at MTK and then manages abroad and plays abroad and manages abroad. But he comes back to Hungary and has a fair bit of success back in Hungary as well, with Újpest, particularly in the 1930s. So you have many people who are lost to Hungarian football in this period in that sense. But you still have a core of people who are developing the game at home who maybe are not so famous for that reason, but I think are very important. And they're usually in one of these two clubs, Ferencváros or MTK. And then in the 1930s, you get Újpest developing as a sort of a third big club in Hungary. And as I say, that's who Bela Gutmann manages back in Hungary in the late 30s. And it's under him. They win a few titles there in the late 30s. They win the Mtropa Cup in the late 30s. So it's nice to see an example like that where a major manager comes back and is able to take forward a Hungarian club into the next level in that way.
By the 1920s and 30s, the game has developed all across Europe. And by now, there's a new tournament called Mtropa Cup. That's, I guess, in the beginning was mostly Central European nations, whether Italy, Switzerland, Hungary, and Austria. How did the Hungarian clubs perform in this Mtropa Cup?
In the first few years, they did very well. So the first year is 1927, and Hungarian teams won 2 out of the first 3 tournaments. So Ferencváros and Újpest both won 2 of the first 3 Mtropa Cups. And then there's really a famine, really, of Hungarian teams in the Mtropa Cup that really coincides with the strength of Italian and Austrian football in the 1930s. So Hungary's fortunes, particularly before the war, are always in the context of Italy, Austria, Czechoslovakia, those big football countries in Central Europe. And I count Italy as a Central European country in this sense, in that most of the football we're talking about is happening in northern Italy and is connected very much to what's going on in Central Europe proper. Those are the big rivals for the national team. Those are the people they play. They play Austria twice a year. They play Czechoslovakia once or twice a year. They play Italy very frequently. So I'm mentioning that because the Mtropa Cup develops very much on those lines. Is a lot of the same players are the people who are involved in the Mtropa Cup in those sort of golden years of it. So in the 30s, the Austria and Italian national teams, I think we can say safely, are the best in the world, certainly the best in Europe. And it's the Austrian and the Italian teams that dominate through most of the 1930s. And then towards the end of the decade, you can trace the resurgence of the Hungarian national team in that decade in what's happening in the Mtropa Cup. It's the elite club competition in Europe, for sure. You can at least say that. The standard of play is incredible by all accounts. And so it's firstly Ferencváros under Zoltán Blum, the man I mentioned earlier. They are the ones who restore Hungary's pride in the Mtropa Cup. They win it in 37. They get to the final in 38. And the players who are driving that success are some of the major stars from the Hungary team in 38. Sárosi in particular, Toldi as well. And then in 39, Újpest win it. That's the last one before the war stops the Mtropa Cup for over a decade. So in Hungarian football, the 1930s are the era where the Ferencváros MTK rivalry becomes the Ferencváros Újpest rivalry. And these two teams are providing the big players for the Hungarian national team. And their strength by the end of the 1930s in the Mtropa Cup is really a testament to the more general situation. And in some ways, you can get a much even better picture, really, of how strong is Hungarian football and these other regional powers. You get actually probably a better picture in the Mtropa Cup than you even get in international football itself. because you're seeing so many more games. And all of those famous names that people love from that era in Central Europe, they're all going toe-to-toe in the Mtropa Cup every year. And it's really a thrilling competition. So the story really, in that first period of the Mtropa Cup, early success for Hungary, and then a big barren period where the Italians and the Austrians are winning every year. And then right at the end, 37, 38, 39, you have a resurgence of Hungarian teams in the Mtropa Cup. And the last one before we don't see the Mtropa Cup for 12 years is an all-Hungary final. Ferencváros and Újpest play the 1939 final. And that's a good reflection of how much stronger Hungary has become in the course of that decade.
So if you make a comparison with Hugo Meisel's Wunder team, I guess we can say that in the beginning of the 30s, obviously the Austrian Wunder team is excellent, while the Hungarian national team is not at the same level. Yet
Right.
at the club level, you're saying perhaps the MTKs and the Ferencváros, those are probably better than Austrian clubs around the same time?
Well, I would say that the Hungarian team is never far behind the Wunder team. I mean, again, these two countries play each other usually twice a year, and the games are usually very, very closely contested. There's only a few occasions where you see Austria really steamrolling the Hungarian team. So I would say that even at the height of the Wunder team, Hungary's not far behind. But I would certainly say if you talk about the early 30s and the mid-30s, Austrian national team and the Austrian clubs are certainly on top. Particularly Austria Vienna is probably the best club in Europe, sort of in the early to mid-30s. That doesn't last long, really. So in autumn of 35, Hungary beat Austria 6-3. And then in the next year, in 36, Hungary beat Austria 5-3 two times. And so I would say that's really the end of just a few years where Austria is definitely on top. And by 36, if there's been a gap, I think it's been closed again. And again, you see that reflected in the Mtropa Cup because Ferencváros and Újpest are able to beat Austrian teams in the late 30s. And by the way, in 34, Hungary beat England for the first time. So I would say 1930, mid-30s is a low point for Hungary, but it very quickly turns a corner. And by the mid-30s, you're seeing the quality that will take them to the World Cup final. To beat England was incredible for Hungary. The only times they had played them before, they'd been heavily thrashed. So it was 1934 they beat England. So yeah, I would say, I mean, I'm sure other people might disagree, but I would say there's never a big gap between Austria and Hungary, and I think it closes quick. It's only lasts a few years that there is a gap at all.
And what would you say generally at that time would be the standing of the Hungarian national team and the expectations maybe going into those World Cups? Would people have been expecting Hungary to be strong contenders at that time?
Absolutely. They did expect them. And when there was failure, there was great wringing of hands. Yeah, absolutely. Now, they expected Hungary to be competitive. They expect Hungary to do well. And again, I think sort of the sharpening of the team is the fact that, to go back to the previous question, we all know how good Austria were at this time. We all know how good Italy were. That's who they were playing. Half the games they were playing at international level were against those teams. So they were constantly testing their wits. And they were always competitive in those games, although Italy started to pull away, perhaps. But the expectation, there was always a good record. Hungary were never had a bad record at international level in the 20s and 30s. And so there was a high expectation of them doing well. And managers who didn't, lost their jobs after the tournament that happened. As some things never change.
Yeah. Who were the key players going into the 1938 World Cup, and what was their future contribution?
Well, you had to mention Sárosi earlier. He's the big star. He's the striker for Ferencváros, incredibly prolific striker. He played some in midfield as well, but his primary contribution was as a forward. He scored over 40 goals for Hungary national team, and he's incredibly prolific in the club game for Ferencváros. He's one of the top scorers every year in the Mtropa Cup. So I would say he's the big star. He's the captain of the team as well. You also have Geza Toldi. He's another Ferencváros player, forward, again, top scorer. Then you have a couple of Újpest players. So you have Gyula Zsengela from Ferencváros. You have Vince, also from Ferencváros. And then, even though those two teams are dominating the league and the national team, you have a really important MTK player still as well, Pal Titkos. And he's like the left winger. Everybody loves a left winger. There's just there's something wonderful about a really dynamic left winger, and he plays that role that you'll often see that player in the great Hungarian teams. And so he's that man in that team, great left foot, and scores a lot of goals, cutting in from the left and unleashing, as you would hope a left winger to do. So I would say those are the big ones. So those two Ferencváros players, the two Újpest players, and Titkos. Some of them go into management. Sárosi and Titkos. Titkos mainly does his managing career abroad. So he goes abroad to Denmark. He manages the Belgian national team as well. And Sárosi goes into management as well. Neither of them are legendary managers.
Well, Sárosi managed Juventus, I believe, right?
He did. He won the Scudetto. He won a Scudetto with Juventus and managed a whole host of other Italian teams. But yeah, so he would certainly be a good example. Most of the great Hungarian managers were not sort of the greatest players. So one of the great Hungarian managers around this time was Árpád Weisz, that many people are familiar with. And I think he had one cap for the national team and didn't have a very long career at all. But of course, he was one of the great managers abroad for Bologna particularly. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Sárosi did manage a lot of teams in Italy and won the Scudetto with Juventus. So he would probably be the pick of that group in terms of their future management career.
There's a couple of stories from the 1938 World Cup adventure. The Hungarian manager, Dr. Károly Ditz, ahead of the match against Switzerland, he had promised to walk back to Budapest if Hungary lost, which fortunately they won. But that's a story that's circulated, I guess, in football history books.
Yeah.
And there's also the story of the Hungarian goalkeeper, Antal Zsabo. Apparently, he said that he had no regrets about conceding 4 goals against Italy in the final because he saved the lives of 11 footballers. And obviously that refers to the whole story that they were under threats from Mussolini if they didn't win in the 1934 and the 1938 World Cups. So those are a couple of stories that are part of a football folklore history.
The interesting about that 38 final is that one of the things that the conspiracy theory revolves around is, so there's a story another player had of Zsengela, actually, that his story was that he saw the manager Dietz meeting with Italian representatives before the game. And when people think that there was some kind of conspiracy, they particularly point to the fact that there were 4 members of the semi-final team who didn't play in the final, particularly Toldi. So Toldi is one of the stars of the team. He's one of these Ferencváros strikers. So he plays in the semi-final. He doesn't play in the final. And so that's one of the, if you believe in the conspiracy, that's one of the pieces of evidence of it, that this key player was dropped for no apparent reason for the final. And that was sort of Dietz's way of bowing to the pressure that he was allegedly being given to make sure that Hungary didn't win the game. Obviously, there's no way to prove that. But the player that he brought in for Toldi was Vince of Újpest, who was a great player. It wasn't like he brought in, the kit man or, the under 18 player into the team. So I'm not sure that Hungary would play worse with Vince rather than Toldi. Also, if you look at the results between Hungary and Italy over the previous 6-8 years, they didn't beat them. They played them every year just about. They played them very often, and they could never beat them. So there need have been no shenanigans to make sure that Hungary lost to Italy, because Italy were the superior team, sad to say. But
and is that reflected in maybe outside Hungary, that team, the 1938 team, certainly less celebrated than 1954? Is that the case within Hungary as well, would you say?
Absolutely, very much so. Yeah. Very much so. Yeah, they're absolutely in the shadow. And I think only in the last few years, some people in Hungary have been really trying to revive the memory of that team. Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt. But that kind of story about it, I mean, the story that the game was thrown in some way is definitely a popular one in Hungary too, because there's, we'll get onto the things like this next time, in terms of the 50s team. But again, the narrative with the 50s team is that it was political reasons that ended that team's dominance. And so there's a desire for some people to say, well, it was the same thing with the 38 team. They would have won, but politics got involved, and that's what stopped them from winning. As I say, it was a really good team, that Hungary team. I think there's no question Italy was a superior team, however. And of course, the other thing as well, of course, with that team is Hungarian football in general, and the national team in particular, was on a big upswing at that time. So who knows what would have happened if that could have carried on to naturally progress? You know, the 42 World Cup, that team might have really come into its own. And that's another one of those tragedies and hypothetical questions, isn't it? How good would that have team carried on to be? And then we might have known more about them, or might have remembered them more. But when the war was over, a lot of these players, their careers had passed by in the intervening time.
As far as this 1938 team, why do you think some of these players became good manager, or at least managers afterwards? What drove them to management?
In some cases, I think it was just necessity. So just as in with the aftermath of World War I was very, very difficult in Hungary, the aftermath of World War II is even worse. Actually, the economic situation in Hungary after World War II was worse than anywhere in Europe. It's the worst inflation in history at that time. People in Britain know a lot about the inflation in Germany after the two world wars, but actually it was much worse in Hungary, because you also had the Soviet occupation of the whole country, and the Soviets were driving the country into the ground in many ways. So a lot of people left the country for economic reasons at that time, if they could get out, which most people couldn't, but if they could get out, they did. And so again, that's really one of the big reasons you see people going into management, particularly abroad, is it's a ticket to get out and to make a living in a more secure place. So honestly, that's one of the big reasons, as far as I can see anyway. But then I think particularly with those players who are coming out of the big three clubs in Hungary, they're coming out of very stable, well-developed systems. So the picture we get is that the players who come through and succeed in those systems are players that are very, not only technically gifted, but have a very clear sense of the skills and how to communicate them. That's what seems to set apart a lot of the Hungarian players. So I think you could take another country and take a similar crop of good players from that period of time. I think a lot of people in England would say English players from that time, for example, and they wouldn't necessarily be able to then go to another country and communicate it very clearly. You know, here are the skills to teach it in that sense. And I think that's it seems to set this group apart, and the previous generation apart as well, was just an ability to be football teachers. You can have a great footballing culture and a great football team and not have a great footballing teaching culture. And I think Hungary had a really good culture of teaching football skills and football technique. And I hate to use the word philosophy, but football philosophy.
Who were the most successful Hungarian managers of these 1930s, and what was their common attributes?
You see this group, almost every European country you can think of, they're involved. Got Bukovi, you've got, obviously Bela Gutman would have to be the most successful, I think. I think there's no way you can get past him. I mean, he won, obviously everybody knows about the European Cups that he won. I think he would have to be the most successful. I mean, one of the extraordinary traits of these managers is how both adaptable they are in terms of the different countries that they move around in South America, in Europe, and how very adaptable. They just don't stay in one place very long, do they? If you look at many of these people, that it's extraordinary to see the amount of clubs that they manage over their 20 or 30-year career. But by the time you get to that post-war period, what you see from these managers is not just an adaptability personally as characteristics to go to a new country and thrive and survive and do that every couple of years, but also, I think, an ability to adapt the standard tactics and standard practices of football teams. So I think, obviously that in some ways it's a topic for another day, but what sets apart the Hungary team of the 50s is the ability to sort of tweak the WM in a way that the other teams couldn't cope with. And so that sort of thing, you see that in, I think, Hungarian managers of the late 40s and 50s, is a high degree of knowledge and sophistication of football, but not an ideology of football. Yet you don't get the sense of there's only one way to play the game and this is the way we're going to play it. They've got ability to adapt to the situation. And one thing we didn't mention, which I think connects to this from earlier on, is that the Hungarian game turns professional in 1926. So that's 1 year after the offside law changes. And it's, I think, as many people know, it's the change in the offside law that pushes the change in football from 235 to the WM. So Hungarian football professionalizes at the same time that the game is going through a big change in terms of how you set up teams and how you play. So I think that was very helpful for Hungary too. The English game was much more developed and so found it harder to change in many ways, didn't it? But you see that trait from those players, because players who were turning professional in the mid to late 20s were often the same crop of people who were then going abroad in the post-war period in the 40s and 50s. So their professional career was played out within that new situation in football, where the offside law really changed things. The new offside law changed things so much, and the tactics were developing quickly in response to that. So technical adaptability, not an ideology, but technical adaptability, I think, is their trait that served them so well around the world. And again, you go back to Bela Gutman, you see that with him. He had a certain way of playing which he had already developed abroad in the 1930s. He comes back to Újpest at the end of the 30s and says, this team can't play that way. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and adapt to how good this team is. So now people like to say, well, there's a straight line. We go from Hungary to total football to Guardiola or something like that. But I think it's a bit of a shame if we turn it into that, because it's not the passing on of a secret. It's not the passing on of a key that unlocks everything, or an ideology or a philosophy in the specific sense. Because I think what connects them is more that sort of ferocious attention to detail, the emphasis on the ability to individual technique, but then the translation of that individual technique into team play that is attacking first and foremost. And that's not really a tactic, is it? That's not really a matter of tactics. That can look very different depending on the situation.
The start of World War II would bring an end to this generation, of this 1938 generation that you mentioned was on an upswing. After the war, in about another decade or so, a new generation would rise, which would be the Magic Magyars, or is that pronounced correctly? Magyars or Magyars?
Magyars,
yes. And the rise of one of the best teams never to have won the World Cup in 1954. We will discuss that in our next podcast with you. Once again, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. We learned a lot, and we'll learn even more next time.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, and looking forward to continuing it next time.
Oh, me too. Thank you.
So as always, feel free to leave questions and comments. I'm on Twitter at SP1873, and my blog and Facebook are under Soccer Nostalgia. Mr. Paul Whittle is on Twitter at 1888 letter, as well as his blog 1888 letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Mr. Reynolds' contact info and the link to his book are on the Spotify podcast and the blog podcast link if you want to contact. Once again, thank you, and looking forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.